Hey everybody, how much do you really know about Liberian history before 1800? Like me, probably not a whole lot.
The beginning of Liberia is based on a coalition of abolitionists on the ground and abolitionists who came from the Americas. There were African Americans who had experienced slavery in the West and they wanted to end it. And there were people on the ground who wanted to end it too.
Hi, I'm Octavius Obe. If we're meeting for the first time, let me say hello. For those of you who remember me from my days at the Liberia Broadcasting System, it's good to see you again. This is my channel. Like the channel, subscribe, and keep your notification bell on. This will help us to create high quality content like this one today. Our conversation with Dr. Carl Patrick Burrows. Dr. Burrows is the author of the book Between the Kola Forest and the Salty Sea, A History of the Liberian People Before 1800. And I begin our conversation by asking him about how we should look at the history of that period, by dates or by important events.
Yeah, that's a really important question. I guess it would seem like I'm trying to dodge, but my answer to you is that we actually need to do both, with an emphasis on events more than on dates. But we also need to look at those events chronologically. So I think that the way history generally is taught in schools and was taught in Liberia, it was about memorizing dates and names. And that can be a real turn-off for young people. But if you focus on the events that are interesting, things are happening and there's drama, sometimes there's some tension and all of that. People are interested in those. It's like watching television, the same kind of drama that exists in reality shows, etc. Would be similar to the dramas in historical stories. But we do need to recount those events chronologically because, events build on each other. If you try to look at history backwards, it's very confusing. But if you start from the beginning and move forward.
So where do we begin? Where do we start?
So that's with our story. I would say let's start with humans. Where did humans begin? And we know that they started in Africa. For now, from all of the archaeological remains that have been found, East Africa seems to be the point of origin of humankind. And from there, people migrated, out of the continent. Some migrated west in our region. Those who came west settled originally in what is now the Sahara Desert, right? We know this from archaeology. The Sahara was not a desert. It was a green and lush, fully inhabited space. Animals, giraffes, all were living there. There was climate change. And when climate change came, people then had to move. And when they moved, an essential ingredient of human life is water. So they moved looking for water. And as they were moving, the original unity of West Africans based on inhabiting the Green Sahara, as it was known. They shared the same language. They shared different, similar religious practices. We shared, polyrhythmic music. So the foundation was shared. But as people began migrating now, they began to split apart. The languages became somewhat different. So all languages in West Africa are said to belong to the Niger-Congo family, and they all have the same root. So that's like the grandmother language. But then as people were separating, right, the languages began to differ. And over time, they differed even more. But the origin...
And so from the Green Sahara, the common history that most of us are aware of, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, at what point in that triumvirate, so to speak, did people come to the area we now know as Liberia?
So I would say that those empires are really attractive, because they're associated with the exportation of gold, right, to the outside world and so forth. And people are living, in an opulent style, those who were traders and who were powerful, people in the society. But they are like the icing, on West African civilization. The fundamental work, the most impressive discoveries and innovations had taken place long before those empires developed. And the things that I'm talking about, innovations that are really critical, the invention of agriculture. When I was in school, we were taught that Africa always received everything from somewhere else. Now we know that that's not true. Africans discovered agriculture on our own, our ancestors did, right? And there are many practices that we invented that were then copied by others. So, for example, iron smelting was developed in Africa to a very high level, to a very high extent. The smelted iron in West Africa was similar to steel. Europe didn't have that process early on. They didn't discover the process of converting iron to that level of strength until they had encountered Africa and China, both of whom had very advanced processes for smelting iron. What we lacked that the Europeans had was coal, and coal allowed for the smelting to take place on a massive level, on an industrial scale. Do you follow? But we were doing ours using specific woods, hardwoods that were used in these smelting operations. So there were, forms of knowledge that our ancestors had developed that were very advanced. The domestication of rice, Americans didn't have that. Europeans didn't have it. We did. We developed it, and it spread along the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, all the way down to Liberia. It came with those who speak what is called the Atlantic branch of the Niger-Congo language, and they include the Wolof, and in Liberia, the southernmost extension of that language family are the Kissi and the Gola. So the rice is associated with the Kissi, rice growing. And on the other side of Liberia, you had a language family that came from Upper Volta area, which is now Burkina Faso, and they came down to Cote d'Ivoire, and then they hit Grand Jide. And that language family, the linguists call Kru, not the ethnic group, they're just saying that there's a affinity, among second languages. So Kru, Bassa, Kran, they, several others, they are related. If you know the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they are similar across the board, Grebo and all. So when they came, their staple food was not rice, it was yam and ero, roots. And eventually that came to be displaced by cassava, But so our people came early, before the empires. They already had domesticated, food. They were farmers. They knew how to smelt iron, etc. What gave the empires the edge over some of the others, made them more prosperous, was trading. And that was just based on location. That was accidental. They were right there in the Sahel, so they were positioned to take advantage of goods flowing from the coast, our ancestors, to the Mediterranean, and vice versa.
And so what were some of the commodities that came from our part of the continent up to the empires?
Well, one, Kola. Kola, the discovery of Kola is associated with our Gola ancestors. But when the word Gola is pronounced in Malinke and in some other languages, the G sound comes out as a K sound. So if you're familiar with porcelain place settings, plates, dishes, Europeans used to call those china. They say these are the fine china in the cabinet, meaning their dishes. And they call it that because it came from the country that we know as China. So there are commodities that are often associated with the people who made them. And that would be one example. And the Gola were the ones who had discovered this commodity, Kola, and they put it on the market, and people associated it with them. Malagata spice. It originally only grew between River Ses and Kepamas. And we have written records of Malagata being traded in Italy and Spain by 1100 AD. So we're talking 1,000 years or so ago. And in Southern Europe, they considered Malagata spice to be the spice of paradise. They associated it with having medicinal properties. So from any student of history, we know that when the Europeans began exploring, a key thing that they were looking for, key commodity, was spices, to liven up their foods, their cuisine. So curries, from Asia, and Malagata was one of the things they were looking for. They used to fill ships with Malagata.
Kola nut that Liberia gave to the world, the multiplicity of cola drinks in the West all around the world now. And of course, everybody knows about Coca-Cola.
Oh, yeah. So when Coca-Cola came initially on the market, it actually had extracts, like juicing the cola seed, right? And it was added to the drink. And the sugar was put there to kind of counteract the bitterish taste of the cola extract. But what our ancestors had discovered about this this nut was that it could suppress your thirst and your hunger, right? So when Americans found out, they used it for that very purpose, so that you could have a soft drink and you wouldn't feel thirsty for a while and you wouldn't want to eat for a while. Then that was like an advantage, especially for hardworking people. Later on, Coca-Cola began substituting a chemical, a synthetic kind of.
Talk a little bit about the religion of our people from that particular era, the coming in of Islam, subsequently Christianity, and how that affected the migration patterns and the movement of people to from the empires to where we now call Liberia.
Mm-hmm. So yes, in West Africa, we really don't have a word for something called religion. And that's in part because religion was not seen as separate from the rest of your life, the rest of your world. It was integral part. And so the best word that we have, closest nomenclature, is the ways of the ancestors. Their way is said to be the best. What their wisdom, their accumulated knowledge they pass to us, we need to follow. And so the wisdom of the ancestors, I want to be clear about what we mean by this word ancestors, because there's a lot of confusion these days about certain words, right? We are very loose about how we use these words. In order for someone to be an ancestor, this person would have lived a life, right, prior to transitioning that was exemplary. The same was true in terms of who was considered an elder. Not every old person, senior citizen, was considered to be an elder. If the traditional ruler needed to consult with people, There are only select people you're consulting with. These are people who carry themselves with self-respect, right? They know when to speak, when not to speak, etc. Anybody can be a senior citizen because you live long, but you could be an old fool as far as people are concerned. So how does the way of the ancestors impact, West African life? Well, it starts from when people are children. It starts with spider stories. The society would entertain children with these stories about a trickster, spider. And most people know the story of spider being invited to 2 feasts in 2 different villages. He's so greedy, he wants to go to both. So he tells them to tie a rope around his waist. When the feast is ready, they should pull him. It happens that both feasts start at the same time, so that both villages are pulling him. And that's how his waist became so tight, is what the children were told. I'm doing an abbreviated version of the story. A good storyteller, you're adding music, you're adding, intonation of voices. It's entertaining. However, the substance of the spider story is actually to teach the children ethics and morality. Spider is an anti-hero. He's a trickster. So the children are being taught, don't be like Spider. He's selfish, right? And it will catch up with him. He's greedy. It will catch up with him. Don't be like Spider. But our people were so sophisticated, they didn't sit the children down and just preach to them like that. They were giving them stories that would make them laugh. But at another level, they're learning. Then you get to a transition from childhood to adulthood. You are removed from the community and you are instructed in how to behave as an adult. And it has to do with being guarded in terms of what you listen to and what you speak. And so if an old person lives that out, the ethics of the community, of the traditions, the theology of it, you are then an elder. And when you die, you are an ancestor. It's like the saints of the Catholic Church. We can vouch for you.
The cardinal principles of the way of the ancestors being the preservation of life. Talk to us a little bit more about that, and what were some of the other principles, and how were these principles preserved and taken from one generation to the next?
So they were preserved, like I said, through storytelling, through different means of socialization. But you see, we think of Africans as not having literacy. And it's true, we didn't have it in the alphabetic form, right? But our masks had symbols. They were coded. Colors had symbolic meaning. And they were instructional. So knowledge was being imparted through all of these different ways, And if you look at the mask that was worn by the head of the Sande Society, there are rings around the neck. And they symbolize the transition from being a caterpillar to becoming a butterfly. How beautiful. It's metaphorical. And there it is, And so the essential lessons were about, preserving life. Now, when I say this, a lot of people will be like, Dr. Boros, you really must be naive, right? What people don't realize is that history intervenes and it changes cultures and tradition. And the biggest impact that we have had on our tradition was the African slave trade. It altered, the societies tremendously. People who were engaged in it, who were involved in it, ended up getting access to arms, to goods and to power. And the traditional rulers, healers, ended up being marginalized, right? So you asked me, like, when I say it was dedicated to the preservation of life, I'll share with you a story, an anecdote I had. Really powerful encounter. I was invited when I was doing the tour of this book. I was invited to speak at a church, and we took questions and answers. It ran for a while. When it was over, I thought everybody was ready to leave now. We were exhausted. But the pastor waited, a Liberian pastor, and he wanted to talk to me separately. And what he wanted to share was that that particular chapter was correct. And he told me his personal experience. He was being trained to be a pastor by missionaries. He was from Lofa. When his father died, he asked leave to go and bury his father. The missionaries initially said no. He said, that man, he's not a Christian, but worse than that, he's in the Poro society, and therefore he's demonic. And they quoted scripture to him as to the fact that you turn your life this way, you leave the other stuff behind. He wrestled all night. He couldn't sleep, he couldn't decide. And by morning, he decided, I'm going to bury my father. And he went to them and he said, and I seen Bible that said, honor your mother and your father. And he said, I'm going. And he said, you know what? Okay, it's okay. You can come back. When you go, you can come back. He said, he told them, my father was in the Poro, and his expertise was pharmacology, the properties of plants. He said, I never saw him charge anyone for healing, but people would come when they were sick, and you tell the children, go pick that leaf and bring it. Go in the bag and take that plant and bring, a bunch or a branch. Bring it, you make something, you give it to the people. He said, if they went and they were healed, depending on the severity of the illness, they might come and bring a chicken. Or if it was even worse than that, they might bring a goat. But it was voluntary. He said, and how can you then tell me that this is a man who ought not be, honored and respected? And what he asked me, he said, you're going to Liberia. I want, when I come, we can collaborate on identifying the properties of those plants. He said, because I remember the plants from my father. And he wants some of the science students at our universities or someplace else to look at them and see what the essential elements are for preserving life.
One area of expertise that our people have is knowledge of the sea and the sea currents.
That was mainly, in the southeast, of course, right? So the crew and were able to a certain extent to identify with a maritime culture, very advanced. And most of us, we don't appreciate the sophistication that was involved. You see, when you live in a context, in a community for an extended period of time, you sometimes automatically acquire knowledge of that place. For example, we know that there's dry season and rainy season in Liberia. We know approximately when it will start, we know when the next one will end. But there's an interesting phenomenon to that. There's an exception to that. And that is in late July, right? Oftentimes in the middle of the rainy season, there's what they call mid-dry. The rain will just stop, sometimes for 2 weeks or a week. It's right around 26. And that's how come we used to be able to have parade around 26, on 26th day or on the weekend of 26, because the rains were for a moment in abeyance. All right, so that kind of knowledge, right? Like during the dry season, if you're in Monrovia, the wind will come, or on the coast, the wind will come, off the sea at a certain hour in the night. cool the place down, and then, sweep that. All of that knowledge, people who were on the ocean and involved in fishing and maritime affairs, they needed to know the currents of the water, the tides, right? The wind condition, because the wind will affect the water, and the tides, and so forth. And they had accumulated that, and it's passed, from parents to children, and so on. When the Portuguese came, they didn't have that knowledge of our Atlantic Ocean. In fact, they didn't have much knowledge about the Atlantic Ocean, period. They were inching their way, taking chance, coming down the coast, come a certain point and go back. They record that information. Next ship comes, they go a little further, etc., until they reach Liberia. And time for them to go back to Europe, they were having serious problems. There were many ships that ended up, wrecked along the West African coast. And the crew were able to teach them that there are two currents in the Atlantic Ocean, like two rivers in the ocean. One of them near the coast, it runs from west to east. You put a canoe in there, and I think starts to carry, it can carry you to Ghana without you paddling very much. You just occasionally to keep the balance or whatever. But you gotta know what time to get in it and so forth. So when the Portuguese would come, their ship would get in that current and would carry them. Without the sails, even if the wind was blowing the other way, it would help. Time for them to go back, they were usually going against that current. But they were told by our ancestors, look, there's another current over there, and that one it's further from the coast, and it goes from east to west. So it can help to carry you to Europe, or at least, to the end of the Cape, West African, and then you go up.
Subscribe to this channel, like the video, share it as well with as many people as you can, so that the word will get out, the word about our history. My question is, if we are to have genuine reconciliation as a people, to what extent do we bring in the slave trade, and how do we handle it?
It's inescapable, and that's part of when I was talking earlier about how our neighbors, in West Africa, the Senegalese, the Ghanaians, the Malians, the Nigerians, all the Rwandans especially, have all gone through their history to come to a grounded understanding of the main processes that affected them. And they're honest about it. Look at the Ghanaians. The year of return that they sponsored 2 years ago netted them $2 billion when they invited people from the diaspora to come. But this wasn't some kind of marketing campaign that just popped into somebody's head, and then they wrote a press release and said, oh, we're inviting people to come, my people, you can't spend money. No, it was rooted in their deep understanding of their history and its connection to the outside world. They took an aspect of their history that was painful, not very attractive, but they owned it. And they said, we ain't lying about it. We're not going to pretend. You can't pretend it away. So Ghana was an area where many, many African captives were exported from. Dahomey, Nigeria, those places, Angola. So they took responsibility. Not all of the Ghanaian ancestors were involved in the slave trade. Nowhere was that the case in Africa. Most people were not, but some people were. So they owned it. And because they were honest about it, right, and because they knew their own story, they knew who they know who they are, they were able to pull off what they did. We, on the other hand, live in denial. But just because you deny something, it doesn't go away. The trafficking of Africans has been a curse for us. It began with the Arabs. So as the empires were growing and they were exporting gold, they also were exporting Africans. And that caused some of our ancestors who were living in the area of the empires to leave, and they sought refuge towards the forest. They came from the area of Mali down towards what is Guinea, close to the border of Liberia. Initially, they stopped at the edge of the forest. So I'm talking the ancestors of the Pele, of the Loma, right? Bandi, others. That's how they came. They came to escape that traffic in human captives. Some of their brethren who speak what is called the Mande language, right? The Mande will include Loma, Pele, Bandi, Mende, Malenke, and so many others. Where they had access to weapons and they were capturing people, sending them to the Mediterranean. You don't believe me? You look at videos of societies in the Middle East. You see some people in Saudi Arabia, sometimes in the government, who you can see they have African features. In Iran, there's an entire province of people who are descendants of Africans, in Turkey, so forth. So this was going on, and it disrupted life in West Africa. So people fled, they came south. They wanted to escape the slave trade. They wanted to preserve the way of the ancestors. Then they come now. The Europeans have been in touch with the Arabs, and they wanted to be able to access African captives for themselves. They come around the coast and come to our way. Do you know when Pedro de Centro arrived in Liberia, they seized someone who came on the ship and carried him back to Portugal? The very first Europeans who came to the coast started seizing people. So that had a profound impact on us. Well, I'll tell you this, Octavius. The hidden story of Liberia's founding is so profound. If we knew the story,
what is the story?
It would fill us with pride. We'll walk around with a different posture altogether. And that story is that the beginning of Liberia is based on a coalition of abolitionists on the ground and abolitionists who came from the Americas. There were African Americans who had experienced slavery in the West and they wanted to end it. And there were people on the ground who wanted to end it too. And they joined. And you know that the transatlantic slave trade ended in Liberia first, before Sierra Leone, before Ghana, Dahomey, etc. The coast of Liberia, they ended it first. The British had their anti-slavery squadron based in Freetown. But you see, the ships were big and they can intercept slave schooners on the ocean. But other corner places where the slave traders were operating, like in the Galinas, they weren't going there at first. But Liberians, and I'm saying Liberians, indigenous Liberians and the repatriates joined. I'm saying everybody put in it, but those who did were the ones who founded that country.
At some point, I think I heard you speaking, you said you were sort of disappointed in your generation and you are hopeful about the younger folks. Why is that?
You know, when the Kola Forest book came out, I assumed that it would be my classmates, my peers, who would be inviting me, let's do a talk or something, or buying a book and calling me and say, oh, my man, I checked out your book. But it wasn't that at all. And so I received an invitation to Minneapolis, and then it grew from 1 to 3 events. And when I looked, most of those involving organizing these events were in their 40s or younger. Then people saw on social media these book events were taking place, and I got invited to just about every major city where there are large numbers of Liberians, right? Philly, Atlanta, etc. And each time the invitation came from Liberians who mostly were in their 40s or younger, and usually younger. That's when the light bulb went off. And I was like, oh, not only is this a demographic difference, but it's a psychographic difference. Younger Liberians are not as cynical as we are, my peers are, right? They haven't given up on Liberia. And they are curious. They want to know. They don't feel like they know everything. So they're looking to learn. And that's how this experience has unfolded. And I'll tell you that when I was in Liberia the last time, we did 3 book events in Liberia. Hundreds of people came. On average, it would have been about 150 to 200 people. One event had 300 people, room capacity, people standing against the wall. It wasn't because of me. Nobody knows me. They didn't know my name. It was the hunger for history, right? Especially among young people. And then there was a play I wrote on Hilary Teague. It's about him, but it's also about the founding of Liberia, which he was involved in intimately. And again, hundreds of people came, and young people cried, young people testified like we're in church.
Between the Kola forest and the Salty Sea, a history of the Liberian people before 1800. Dr. Boris, thank you so much for doing this. We appreciate it.